Good morning. This is Mr. Fernandez coming at you from my front porch. We can hear the lovely sounds of a Saturday morning, uh, including my neighbors mowing their lawn. But I've tested this out, and it appears that you should be able to hear me. Okay. So anyway, today I'm here to briefly describe to you the um, the history of the British colonies after the founding of New England and the Chesapeake, those two earliest colonies that we discussed for a long time in the last couple of weeks. The question now is what happened next? How did the colonies develop? How did New England and Virginia um, uh, lead to more colonies in those two regions, and how did those colonies develop differently? I'll also talk a bit about another colonial region that is settled in the late 1600s and early 1700s, and that's the so-called middle colonies. So the learning target for you is to be able to describe the development of the British American colonies all the way through about 1750, which will take us into the next unit when we'll start thinking about the American Revolution and the causes thereof. Here's the key concept. According to the AP curriculum, uh, one major concept from the colonial period is that Europeans developed a variety of colonization and migration patterns influenced by different imperial goals, cultures, and the varied North American environments. You've already seen that with New England and the Chesapeake colonies, how those how the goals of establishing those two colonies, um, uh, the different cultures of the people who were involved in establishing those colonies, and of course the different environments in which those colonies were established led to very different patterns of colonization and migration. The economies were very different. The societies of the two places were very different in the early years, especially demographically and otherwise, in terms of religion, for example, excuse me, etc. Now we're going to see how this story continues beyond Virginia and New England. One big thing to see is that we're talking about when we move on to the 1700s, we're talking about a period of great population growth in the American colonies. By the end of this period, well, by 1750 or so, you can see in the middle there, the colonies have grown to be at least 1 million people, well, more, if you, including African Americans or persons of African descent, who most of whom are enslaved. The colonies, in other words, have grown tremendously by 1750. That's a big part of the story here. I'm going to structure this lecture like this. I'm going to start by looking at the southern colonies, reminding you about Virginia and Maryland, the Chesapeake colonies, and then describing the growth of those colonies and the addition of new colonies in the South. I'm going to do the same thing for New England after that, and then I'm going to describe to you the middle colonies, a new colonial region that we haven't yet looked at, except when examining colonialism by the Dutch in New York. So here's a picture of all of the American colonies. We're going to look at the three colonial regions one by one, starting with here, the South, moving on to New England up here, and then turning to the so-called middle colonies, called that, of course, because they were in between the two earliest settled regions, British settled regions. All right, so let's start with the southern colonies. The southern colonies, you might say, started out pretty roughly. As you remember, Jamestown barely made it in the first decade or so because of disease, because of the climate there, the heat, the humidity, the mosquitoes that thrived in such an environment would spread illnesses. This was a society that almost didn't make it, British colonial society in the Chesapeake. But then by the end of this period, it is a thriving slave-based plantation economy. In fact, a set of plantation economies throughout the southern colonies by 1750. Um, so here you can see an image of just what we're talking about here. As far as the southern colonies go, we're talking about the Chesapeake region, which was the first settled area in the southern colonies, which, you know, as time went by, grew into the interior, into the western frontier, and then with the establishment of the Carolina colonies and the Georgia colony in the early 1700s, the southern colonies grow uh, considerably by the eve of the American Revolution. So let's tell that story first. What new colonies were established in the South? First, after Maryland and Virginia, was the Carolinas in 1663. This was a royal grant, meaning the king gave wealthy aristocrats in Britain the right to establish a charter to establish colonies in the area that came to be known as the Carolinas. So these colonies started out as proprietary colonies, meaning they were established by people, individuals who were given the right to rule over those colonies. The other people who came over in the early part of the history of the Carolinas were people who lived in the British islands, or at least the British-controlled islands, in the Caribbean, especially Barbados. One story we haven't told, and we really don't have time to tell, is the numerous colonies in the Caribbean part of the Americas, owned by the Spanish, or at least claimed by the Spanish, by the French, and by the British. The British owned colonies like Barbados and Jamaica. These were sugar plantations overwhelmingly. Sugar was a very highly sought after commodity in Europe, and sugar plantations therefore were numerous in the Caribbean. And these were places, I'm going to fix this, these were places where slavery really took off at an early period. A lot of enslaved people were brought to North America, as you know, but far more enslaved people were brought to the Caribbean islands to work in the very, very profitable sugar plantations. Well, a lot of the settlers, the English settlers who were living in Barbados, saw opportunities in the new southern colonies, especially Carolina, later on Georgia, and brought with them their money and their so-called slave capital, the people that they owned, including their system of slavery, which was much more brutal, much more harsh than than even the brutal, harsh slavery of Virginia and Maryland. Some other people who came to the Carolinas included tobacco farmers from the north, from Virginia. These were the poorer sorts of people who had less access to the better land and sought opportunity in the Carolinas, and they ended up settling in the more mountainous, rocky northern regions. Officially, the colonies of the Carolinas split in two. South Carolina became the colony of the rich, aristocratic planters, many of them from the Caribbean islands, who owned large numbers of slaves and produced things like rice, which I'll show you in just a second. And then North Carolina was the colony consisting more of smaller farmers with fewer slaves or none, who farmed the land that was no good for rice, and therefore were far less wealthy than the folks in South Carolina, who built these fabulous homes in places like Charleston, South Carolina. So right away you see this rift between the wealthy, powerful people in South Carolina with huge rice plantations and huge numbers of slaves, and the smaller farmers in North Carolina in the early 1700s. Georgia was established too before 1750 by a land grant to James Oglethorpe. Many of you learned about this in 8th grade. Yes, what they say is true that Oglethorpe had this vision of a slaveless society in Georgia, but as you may or may not have been taught, that didn't last very long before planters saw opportunities there, and the utopian vision of Oglethorpe and a society without slaves was very quickly undermined. The British established Georgia primarily because uh, out of concern with the presence of Spanish uh, colonists in Florida, which they claimed as their own, and they were concerned with alliances between Spain and Native Americans in the area, and attacks on South Carolina, the very rich plantations of South Carolina, um, by the Spanish and the Native Americans and who are often their allies. Georgia was established as a kind of buffer colony between the rich plantations of South Carolina and the Spanish Florida. So, what can we say about the economies of the southern colonies in 1750? There were some differences, some very important differences, like I've already kind of alluded to, but there were also some similarities. Like Virginia and Maryland, the Carolinas and Georgia were, in a warm climate, and much of that land was suitable for the production of staple or cash crops. A cash crop is something like tobacco that is not consumed, not eaten, but is hugely profitable. And for a long period of time, it was in the Chesapeake, and then later on in pieces of North Carolina. And so there are large slave populations in those areas. the In the kind of marshier, lower-lying areas of South Carolina and Georgia, so think like Savannah today, that kind of area in Georgia, the eastern coastal region of Georgia. Those places were also suitable for rice cultivation and indigo, which was a plant used to dye, like a purple dye, which was very popular in Europe too. And so you had large plantations down there, growing these profitable crops. Along the eastern, or rather western parts of these colonies, there were smaller farms, places. These were areas where there was less opportunity for growing these profitable staple crops. Smaller farms, fewer slaves, a lot more poor whites in the western portions of these colonies. So here's a map, kind of summarizes what I said. There you see the rice, indigo lands, especially in the coastal regions of the Carolinas, especially South Carolina and Georgia. You see how the kind of the shading becomes a little bit lighter as the land. Yes, the further you go into the west, the land becomes less and less suitable for that, for those pursuits. And then, of course, you see the tobacco regions of Virginia, eastern North Carolina, Maryland. You can also see how you can see the sort of brown shading in the mountainous areas where trading with Native Americans was still a profitable pursuit for furs and skins. So what about politics? The political conditions of South Carolina, of the southern colonies were pretty similar. All of the colonial legislatures in Virginia and Maryland and the Carolinas and Georgia were, well, first of all, they all had colonial legislatures. So that's a big thing, right? They all had elected legislatures, elected by very few people, mostly, but elected nonetheless. The legislatures were dominated by the wealthy, people with property, especially those largest planters in the area, the ones that planted tobacco, rice, and indigo. So you remember that, one example of a colonial legislature in the South is the House of Burgesses. It was still going on, going strong in the 1700s, becoming more of a major political institution that called pretty much all the shots by this time period, by 1750. There it is, a modern recreation of the House of Burgesses in today's Williamsburg, Virginia. We can also talk about the social conditions of the colonies in the South. Um, Firstly, of course, the Church of England was established in every colony. So this is an important thing. The Church of England was established in England. It was the official church. You lived in England, you had to pay taxes to support the Church of England. So this was kind of the default for colonies in British North America. The folks who established those colonies, for the most part, brought with them English institutions, and that included the practice of establishing a church, the official Church of England. So that's exactly what happened in every colony in the southern colonies. Maryland was an exception at first, but that was quickly done. That was quickly done away with. Yes, Maryland was established at first to provide a haven for Catholics, but by 1649, by 1692, sorry, that you know the policy of allowing people to practice their own religion in Maryland ended with the repeal of the Maryland Act of Toleration. So that's one thing. Another thing to know about the southern colonies is that there were high levels of social inequality. So this was the place where you saw in all of the British colonies the most disparity between the richest people and the poorest people, especially where you saw in Virginia and South Carolina, where there were these, you know, planter aristocrats who owned so much land, a huge number of enslaved people, and had so much of the economic and political power as well. This is where people from Europe who were used to the ostentatiousness and of the aristocracy in Europe, if they were looking for that in the Americas, the best place to look would have been in cities like Charleston, South Carolina, in Savannah, Georgia, in Jamestown, Virginia, where the richest people tended to have fabulous homes and the political power that came with their wealth. Newer immigrants, as they started to come in the 1700s, they because all the best land was taken up by that point, all the best land for growing rice and tobacco, for example. Newer immigrants tended to settle along the western frontier, so you see that same pattern of new immigrants being pushed into the west. Another thing to say about the southern social conditions is that there were a large number of Scots-Irish people. So these are people from Great Britain who had been displaced from Scotland into Northern Ireland. They were called Scots-Irish, and they were a very distinct ethnic group in Britain with little power, little capital, and many of them came and settled, especially along the Appalachian Mountains, all the way up from from northern Georgia through western Virginia. These people had very little allegiance to the British crown, to British authorities. They were oppressed by the British authorities, British back home, and so it's important for later that these folks will be inclined to side against the British in the Revolutionary War. Of course, the other important thing, right, is that you read about already, or actually will read about, is that in the southern colonies, this is where you had the largest number of enslaved people. That you can see on this graph here, actually in this graph here. So the southern colonies, this is the black population, the white population, and of course you see here that it's the southern colonies where you see the largest number of persons of African descent. With the production of rice and tobacco and indigo came a need for large pools of labor, and we've talked about the origins of the slave regime, the origins of legal codified slavery in Virginia and Maryland. That pattern of bringing in enslaved people that started in Virginia And Maryland, of course, continues into the 1700s and defines the other southern colonies as well. In fact, if you look at South Carolina, from almost from the very beginning, because so many planters came from the Caribbean to settle there, bringing along with them their money and their enslaved people, South Carolina became almost a majority black colony from the very start. Now we turn to the New England colonies, and we can see how they developed as well after the establishment of Massachusetts and Plymouth by Puritans. What became of them? And one big thing, I think, the one way to summarize the story is that the New England colonies started off as this kind of Puritan haven, this city upon a hill, of John Winthrop, and it became a commercial powerhouse, especially along in the coastal regions and in the major cities. A very different place than that imagined by people like John Winthrop and the other Puritans of the early 1600s. So New England was, of course, established by this Puritan Great Migration of the 17th century. This migration was international in scope, or global in scope, I should say, meaning Puritans, many tens of thousands of Puritans left England for the Americas, but some of them came to North America. Many of them went to the Caribbean, where they established sugar plantations and developed those colonies there. These are the earliest New England colonies established by Puritans, but quickly settled by other people as well. There's Plymouth, there's Massachusetts Bay Colony, there's the early city of Boston. So these are all the places we talked about. This is Rhode Island, and Providence, which was established by Roger Williams as a haven for those who wanted true religious freedom, including from the Puritans, meaning freedom from the oppression of the Puritans in Massachusetts, and Plymouth, who did not allow people to practice any other religion. And just like in the southern colonies, more New England colonies were established after Massachusetts and Plymouth. You had Connecticut, established in 1636, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire, established very early on as well. Let's talk a little bit about the economies of New England. New England, like we've said before, had rocky soil, long winters, so things like tobacco, rice, that wasn't going to grow there. It was too cold, the soil was not right for it. And in part because of that, in part because of the original motivations of the Puritans, who just wanted to establish communities devoted to pursuing their religious vision. Subsistence agriculture on small family farms was the norm. And it continued to be the norm for a long period of time through the 1700s. But in other places in New England, in places like Boston and Providence, what you saw was a development of a thriving merchant economy tied to transatlantic trade. What we mean by transatlantic trade is trade between the Americas and Europe and Africa, if you include that sort of triangular trade. We'll talk more about that on Block Day, but this is a big story here. We've told this story when we talked about the Salem witch trials, and how one of the theories is that the folks in Salem Village were concerned about the growth of a commercially minded, not really, weak Puritan or non-Puritan population by the late 1600s. People who didn't care about Puritanism were there, had different goals and values. Well, this is exactly what I'm talking about. Boston and Providence and Salem town and other cities like that developed thriving economies, thriving commercial economies, where where the main activity is the buying and selling of goods and services, the shipping, importing and exporting of goods and services across the Atlantic Ocean. So that becomes one of the hugely important element of New England. They also developed local, economic activities like shipbuilding and logging and rum distilling. So, sugar was huge in the Caribbean. A lot of that sugar would be shipped to places like Boston and Providence, and then would be made into rum, which is a liquor which was very popular in Europe and in the Americas. Um, and so the production of rum was a huge economic activity in New England as well. So what was that? Hello. I don't know what that was, but I'm gonna assume that we're okay. So what you're seeing, therefore, a is the development of a major merchant elite in the major cities of New England. In places like Boston, Providence, you see, whereas before, New England was much more balanced as far as the distribution of economic resources, small farms in small communities. Now you're seeing the development of a super rich elite in places like Boston. Much less still wealth disparity than in the southern colonies, where the wealthy people were just so much more wealthy than the poorest people. But still, now you see a growing disparity in New England as well. So here's a map that shows you the major exports of the New England colonies. And just to kind of to drive home my point about how much New England became a place for trade. If you look at Boston, Boston is the one city here on this list that is in New England, and it is the city where you see the most ships leaving its port during this time period in the colonial period per year. And here's a picture of Boston Harbor. So see how different this is from from our image of the Puritan community established around small town centers with a church in the middle and then small family farms. Here you see a bustling city, a busy city with thriving with a thriving shipping sector and trade. Here's Boston again. It has really grown up by this point. As far as the political conditions in New England, the strong democratic traditions continue into the 1700s. Just like in the early years, the local town meetings, so the meetings of the male church members, whether or not they had property, who would make decisions that affected all the people in the town, those continued. A relatively very democratic institution. Those town meetings would elect members of the colonial legislature. So, for example, the Massachusetts General Assembly, the members were elected by the town meetings. So the tradition of greater democracy in New England and anywhere else in the British North American colonies continues into the 1700s. As far as the social conditions in 1750, the Puritan Church continues to be the official church in every colony, meaning it is the established church. You have to pay taxes to support the Puritan Church, otherwise known as the Congregationalist Church. And the only exception was Rhode Island, where there was no established church, where people could practice any religion they wanted to. That was the one exception. Okay. Let's move now to the middle colonies in the last area, and the one that we've only talked about briefly when we talked about the Dutch colonies in New Amsterdam, and later when the British took it over, the colony of New York. So the story of the middle colony is that it becomes this kind of like small Dutch outpost, this little tiny colony in New Amsterdam, in what today's New York, Manhattan, New York City, all the way up the Hudson River to include today's Albany, New York. To it goes from that to becoming one of the biggest urban centers in North America, diverse, multicultural urban center. That's the story of the Middle Colonies. So here's the map of the Middle Colonies. Middle because, of course, there's sandwiched between the Southern and New England colonies up here. It includes New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. Delaware depends on who you talk to, but we're going to focus on New York and Pennsylvania. And as you can see, the economies of New York and Pennsylvania tend to be, continuing the tradition of trading with Native Americans for furs. You see, that's a big deal in the western frontier. And then the production of cattle and grain, so wheat, corn, things like that, is a huge economic activity there. We'll talk more about the cities as well. But first, let's talk about the founding of Pennsylvania, of one of the colonies, in the Middle Colonies, and that's Pennsylvania. So the important thing to know about this is that Pennsylvania was founded by a group of people known as the Quakers. Many of you know about the Quakers. There's a Quaker church or a meeting house rather, in Decatur, and it's still a Christian denomination today. The Quakers in England were considered a very radical religious minority. Even more so than the Puritans, they were persecuted. In fact, the Puritans hated the Quakers more than they hated anybody else. The Quakers stood out because they had some practices and values that were very radically different from those of those who adhered to the Church of England. For example, the Quakers believed that they could not, in good conscience, pay taxes to support the Church of England. So they refused. They would go to jail instead of doing it. The Quakers were also hyper-democratic. They didn't pay. There was no paid clergy. There was no church government. Everybody called all the shots. The meeting house, the Quaker community would make all the decisions together in a very hyper-democratic way, and that included with women and men who were treated as equals when it came to worshiping in the Quaker tradition. Quakers were also pacifists. They refused military service, which was often required in Great Britain. They did not believe that they ought to be committing violence against other people. By the way, that Quaker pacifism continued continued all throughout American history. There's histories written about Quaker pacifists refusing military service in places like in wars like the Vietnam War. So they were super persecuted in England, these Quakers were, and therefore were anxious to find a place to be who they wanted to be without persecution. They found their opportunity in the relationship between William Penn and the king. William Penn was a wealthy guy, an aristocrat, who converted to Quakerism. And it just so happens that William Penn's dad was owed a whole bunch of money by the king. So King Charles is like, hey, listen, let's just settle this debt. William Penn, I owe your dad money. Here's a whole bunch of land in North America. It's yours if you just consider the debt repaid that way. And so Pennsylvania became a proprietary colony owned by William Penn and his family in 1681, and quickly established as a place for Quakers to go to practice their religion without having to worry about the government curtailing their religious freedom. So let's talk about the political, economic, and social conditions of places like Pennsylvania and then New York as well. All of the colonies in the Middle Colonies, just like in the South, just like in New England, had representative assemblies elected by landowners primarily. So this becomes a big part of the story. This is very different from French colonies in North America, from Spanish colonies. The British arrive with the expectation that there will be some kind of representation, something that they had in Great Britain with Parliament. So just like in the southern colonies and in the New England colonies, these proto or pseudo-democratic institutions were transported from Britain to the New World. Same thing in the middle colonies. The economies of the middle colonies depended a lot on their geography. There was good soil and moderate climate, not great for things like tobacco and rice, which required warm climate, much warmer climates, but good for things like wheat and corn and other staple crops that were exported to Europe and then down into the Caribbean to feed the huge labor pool of people down there working in sugar plantations. And then Philadelphia and New York developed into major cities for trade. Just like Boston, Providence, and the other cities in New England, so too Philadelphia and New York became these hubs of the transatlantic ocean trade. So you can see a map that kind of illustrates that. Here's an image from the 1700s of New York City, the port. You can see how much of a major, bustling port it is. I can see that my neighbors have their leaf blower out, but hopefully you can still hear me despite that noise. And here is a population of the largest cities in North America. So you can see that Philadelphia and New York have become the biggest cities in North America by the end of the 1700s, just before or by the last quarter of the 1700s. Just before the American Revolution. Boston is a close third. And in the southern colonies, the only major city was Charleston, and it always lagged behind those other cities. Social conditions in the middle colonies. Because Pennsylvania was established by Quakers, who wanted religious freedom, they established a church. Established a colony where religious freedom was allowed to all. So there was no established church in Pennsylvania. There was total religious freedom. There as well. In New York, there was also religious toleration. People could more or less worship how they wanted to in New York as well. And so, in the middle colonies, you see the greatest diversity in British North America. There were a large number of Germans, many of whom came from Europe looking to practice their own religions here in the New World. Many came from places like France, French Protestants. In France, being Protestant Christian meant persecution, and so many of those French Protestants came to the middle colonies where they could practice their own religion. From Wales and Great Britain, the Dutch, many of whom had stayed behind from the earliest generations of New Amsterdam, Swedish people, Jewish people, Irish people, etc. This was the most diverse colony in all of the middle colonies was the most diverse colony or region in all of the British North America, because of that religious freedom, especially, and because of the economic opportunity there, especially in places like Philadelphia and New York, those major cities. So you can see here a graph kind of illustrating the point. These middle colonies, Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, had the fewest number of English people from England, folks from other parts of the world, other parts of Great Britain and Europe were very much represented there. Oops. And then lastly, the other thing to say about this is that, here, I'm going to go over here. The enslaved population of the middle colonies may have been smaller compared to the southern colonies. But in places like New York and Pennsylvania, there was a lot of urban slavery. I mean, in the thousands, people from Africa were forced to labor in cities like New York, um, uh, in very different conditions than in Virginia and the Carolinas, where they labored mostly on farms and plantations. But it's important to note that slavery did exist in the Middle Colonies. It was legal, even in Quaker Pennsylvania, and that it was a major institution, especially in places like New York City. So now that means you have seen the social, political, and economic conditions of the three major colonial regions, the southern, New England, and middle colonies, by 1750. And therefore, you're able to talk with some authority about how Europeans developed a variety of colonization and migration patterns influenced by different goals and cultures, and of course, the environments in North America where they settled. Thank you for listening, guys.